And I stand in this place clearly outlining the Greens' strong opposition to the TPP. We have stood in this place for a number of years now, being very concerned at Australia signing up to what really is a shocker of a trade deal. A shocker when it comes to sovereignty of our nation, a shocker when it comes to the rights of Australian workers, and a shocker when it comes to protecting our environment. Now, of course, Mr. Acting Deputy President, we've just heard a number of issues outlined by the Labor Party and the opposition today by Senator Carr, a number of the concerns in relation to this TPP agreement. Well, yes, there are big problems with the TPP, and it is just so tragic that the Labor opposition, rather than standing up on these principles and fighting to ensure that Australia doesn't get locked into this dodgy deal, are prepared to roll over and vote with the Morrison government on this deal today. Now, we know there are a number of members in this place and the other House within the Labor opposition who are very concerned about Labor's position on this, and rightly so. And kudos to those members who have stood up in their own party room and tried to fight and hold back the tide. I'm sorry you didn't win, and I'm sorry you didn't win because actually Australia needed you to. Democracy needed you to, the Australian environment needed you to, and Australian workers need you more than ever. And yet what we've got is the opposition rolling over to vote with the Morrison government to tick this dodgy deal through. Now, the irony, of course, is that we can list as many terrible things that this deal does as possible, but because of the way trade negotiations are undertaken, we can't fix any of this in this piece of legislation. So we have to take it or leave it. And this is such a bad deal that we should be leaving it. There is no point playing around, trying to say, oh, after the fact we might fix it, which of course is what the Leader of the Opposition, Bill Shorten, is doing. Well, you can't fix it afterwards, mate. That's the point. It's a dodgy deal. It's been done. We've got to kill it once and for all. That is what has to happen. And that is the metal that needs to be relied on in this place today. Don't tick this through with some false hope being given to Australian unions and Australian workers that somehow down the track, if Bill Shorten was ever to become Prime Minister, that you could fix it, because we know that is just not the case. It cannot be done. The truth is Australia would have to withdraw from the TPP altogether before anything could be amended. So why sign up to it in the first place? This is a bad deal designed in the back room to benefit the boardroom and corporations. This deal is for corporations, not the community. This deal is for big multinational corporations at the expense of people. We know that the economic benefits are exaggerated and the costs are downplayed. Big Industry's own modelling shows that grain exports will not change and other agriculture may decline, as well as the potential of a 2% decrease in durable manufacturing. This is a pretty cruddy deal. We know that at the time that it was negotiated by the former Minister for Trade, Mr Chobo, that he was so desperate to come home with something, he signed Australia up, despite the fact that there really isn't the economic benefits that those on the other side are trying so desperate to crow about. To make matters worse, the agreement represents an affront to democracy and sovereignty because of the insidious ISDS clauses. This should be absolutely rejected up front in the strongest possible terms. Now, these ISDS clauses, the investor-state dispute settlement provisions, means that big corporations will have more power than ever before to sue Australian governments and the Australian people, regardless of whether our governments are doing things that we have asked them to do or not. This means These measures advance the interests of these corporations over the interests of governments and citizens whom they are accountable to. ISDS provisions expand the legal rights of multinational corporations based on legal concepts not even recognised in our domestic legal systems, and offer advantages to those multinational companies that are not even available to domestic investors. So it's simply unfair, even from a business perspective. They're unfair, they're unrepresentative, and they're unnecessary. The fact that they are unnecessary has been recently upheld in the European Court of Justice. The decision made in 2017 and again this year in 2018 by the European Court of Justice found that ISDS provisions are fundamentally incompatible with national sovereignty. We should be listening. We should be listening to the experience of others before we sign up to something that includes these provisions. As a result of this finding, the EU is now proposing that ISDS clauses are not to be acceptable in any of their trade negotiations or trade deals, including in the EU's trade negotiations with Australia. So in our negotiations with the EU, which have only recently commenced, the EU has said, we're not going to talk to you if you want ISDS provisions. That is the same approach that we should be taking in relation to the TPP or any other trade negotiations that are on foot. The New Zealand government has made it clear throughout negotiations that it does not support the inclusion of ISDS provisions as part of the TPP, and they've spent time negotiating before signing on the dotted line to ensure that ISDS provisions have been removed through 4 supplementary legally binding letters with Brunei, Malaysia, Peru and Vietnam. They obviously saw that there was a desire amongst the New Zealand community to have their government stand up for sovereignty, democracy and the right of New Zealanders to have laws in their interests, not in the interests of big corporations. Australia has not negotiated any such agreement. We are now left with a TPP that assigns Australia up to these terrible provisions, undermines our democracy and sovereignty, and of course cannot be renegotiated after the fact. We've heard from the Labor opposition that they promise to renegotiate them if they form government. Well, this is an absolute farce and needs to be called out for the furphy that it is. They cannot have it both ways. Why would any country enter into renegotiating with Australia just because there's a change of government when the opposition at the time had the opportunity to fix it once and for all? The sad reality is that this legislation, when it passes this place today, will be subject to ISDS provisions. Labor will not be able to wind them back without withdrawing fully from the TPP. They will be committing Australian taxpayers and citizens to an agreement which they say themselves is against their own party's platform. No wonder Australian unions and workers are furious at the Labor position today. ISDS powers are routinely used by corporations to attack governments and communities for doing what the governments are supposed to do, namely regulating in the interests of their citizens. In 2016, Swiss pharmaceutical company Novartis filed an ISDS dispute against the Colombian government over the government's plans to reduce prices on patented treatment for leukemia. So here the Colombian government wanted to reduce the cost of medication to deal with leukemia so that its citizens could access it, and the big pharmaceutical company came and said, oh no, we'll sue you for that. It is just appalling that this type of power is being handed to these big multinational corporations at the expense of the rights of the Australian people to have our government legislate and regulate in our best interests. We know in this place often, over and over, we talk about the power and the influence of big corporations on politics. Well, this TPP legislation before us today is no better example. This deal has been put together for the interests of big corporations at the expense of the community and at the expense of the rights of the people. We know that in Canada, in 2017, the Canadian Bear Creek Mining Company was awarded $26 million from the government of Peru because the government cancelled a mining licence after the Canadian company failed to obtain informed consent from Indigenous landowners. So in that case, we had a big multinational mining corporation going into Peru, not having the right consent from the Indigenous owners, and when the Colombian government wanted to do something about it, the big multinational company said, "Oh, well, we're going to sue you," because the government was standing up for its own people. Just imagine if we sign this piece of legislation into law today and the world's biggest coal mine in Queensland, run by Adani, starts thinking that they can sue their way into operation. That is the type of thing that is on the line today. Giving these corporations this massive amount of power to undermine the interests of the Australian people. We are opening ourselves up to the risks of ISDS, and it is simply unjustifiable. The government will argue, and we've heard it time and time again, that these provisions are needed because they give certainty to investors. Well, how about certainty to the Australian people to know that when they demand action from the government will do it and it will stand, that it won't be overridden because of the desire of a multinational or corporation. Of course, these provisions are even more inexcusable given the United Nations IPCC report, which was tabled last week, which served as yet another reminder of our gross inaction on climate change. And while successive governments have frittered away the last decade squabbling over climate and energy policy, we have moved closer and closer to thresholds that our scientists warn will dramatically and drastically change life on the planet. And while the environmental provisions in the TPP are wholly inadequate, the real risk is that these ISDS provisions will stop real action on climate change. Because these big multinational companies don't give a damn of the impact of their operations on the people, on the communities, and they certainly don't consider the impact on the environment or future generations. Stopping governments from taking necessary action in the best interests of its citizens and our environment is just unthinkable. That is what our governments should be doing, looking after our community and acting in the best interests of its citizens. Which is why I'll be moving a second reading amendment and foreshadowing it here that will stop this TPP legislation in its tracks. We should not be considering this legislation anymore until these provisions are removed and until the issues in relation specifically to the rights of Australian workers to know that there is proper labour force market testing are actually in place. This TPP legislation commits Australia to accepting an unlimited number of temporary workers from Canada, Mexico, Chile, Japan, Malaysia and Vietnam. These workers will be spread across a wide range of professional and technical skilled trades and occupations. The agreement does not require that there be any labour market testing to establish whether there are local workers who could do these jobs first. Not even an initial check is required. These workers would then be brought to Australia to work in jobs and on projects regardless of whether there are Australians, and particularly young Australians, who are ready and able to do the job on the same project. This weakens our domestic labour market, and of course it exploits these temporary workers all at the same time. Migrant temporary workers remain tied to one employer for the course of their time in Australia, and they face deportation if they lose their job for any other reason. This means the exploitation of these workers will remain high and very risky. Australia has benefited greatly from the contribution of migrant temporary workers, and they perform a vital role. But they must be protected by genuine rules and regulations that ensure they are not exploited. This TPP deal not only opens them up to exploitation, but as a result pushes down the rights of workers here in Australia domestically as well. We know already that the Fair Work Ombudsman says that 1 in 10 complaints to the agency in 2015 came from the exploitation of migrant workers. It is happening already, and this deal will make it even worse. When we sign up to trade agreements, we should be signing up to ensure it maximises job opportunities for Australian workers and that it gives proper protection for both domestic and migrant workers as a gold-clad guarantee, not to allow them to be further exploited and undermined. These agreements are written for corporations so that they can continue to exploit Australian and foreign workers twofold. Meanwhile, those corporations get to bank their profits and nobody looks in either direction. And if all of these reasons weren't enough, of course we're sceptical, as the Productivity Commission has been, of the economic modelling promised by the government in relation to this deal. Of course, we've had no independent modelling from the Australian government in relation to this. They promise that things will get better, but in fact all of the modelling that has been done proves otherwise. The government makes generous assumptions of full employment and costless adjustment to claim there will only be winners and not losers. But anyone who's watched trade negotiations unfold know there's always winners and losers. And it's whether the government of the day is willing to be upfront about that. That's what counts. And what we've seen over and over again is that this government is wanting to brush all of the issues under the carpet. The government assumes perfect labour mobility and assumes away any income distribution effects or trade balance effects. The government can't promise anything except that this is a dodgy deal. What is surprising is that the economic benefits, once you've factored in all of those rosy assumptions that are coming from the government side, the benefits remain stubbornly minuscule. US Peterson Institute has produced a study which said that they estimate a very small increase for Australia's GDP after 15 years of 0.6%. For Australia, this represents a growth between 0 and 0.1% per year. This is somewhere between nothing and a rounding error. So we've got a deal before us today that signs away the rights of citizens to have the government implement policies and laws in their best interests, a deal that undercuts the ability for Australian workers to get a look in first and foremost if they're able to do a job, a deal that allows for multinational corporations to exert even more power over the government of the day, to create a chilling effect on regulation, and for what? A rounding error, perhaps, of economic benefit. It's a dodgy deal and it should be thrown out.
Thank you, Senator Hanson. Senator Brockman.
Mr Acting Deputy President, before I move on to speak about the Trans-Pacific Partnership and these bills